Hey guys, Donnie here at the Mara Group at eXp Realty. Hope everybody's doing well today. Want to shoot you all a quick video, help you out a little bit. I get a lot of questions about earnest money. So wanted to just kind of jump into earnest money, what it is, what it's for, what happens with it, that kind of stuff. So basically, number one is it's money that a buyer puts up when they put a home under contract to show that they're serious about buying the home. Some people call it trust money. Both words are actually used in the contract, trust money and earnest money. But the seller is taking a risk because they're taking their home off the market. When you put it under contract as a buyer, that means they're losing marketing time. And if you don't close on the home as that buyer, they've lost that marketing time. Their home may look a little bit more stale, show more days on the market, that kind of stuff. Plus it could mess up their plans to move, that kind of thing. So the earnest money shows the seller that the buyer is serious about purchasing the home. People often ask, what happens to the earnest money? Generally, the contract goes through, the buyer purchased a home, that earnest money gets credited back to the buyer at closing, and they usually put it towards their closing cost or down payment or whatever the case might be. Either way, it's credited to some of the funds that they need to close on the home. So that's how that works. Oftentimes, sellers think that they get the earnest money or that the earnest money belongs to them. The earnest money is always the buyer's money. It is held in an escrow account, which is usually by either the seller's broker or the seller's broker, real estate broker that is representing them, or the attorney that is representing the seller. And it's held in an earnest money account, and there are very specific Tennessee state laws that describe when it can be distributed, how it can be dispersed, how it's held, that kind of stuff. So it's held in an escrow account. So then, of course, the big question becomes, if you're a buyer, when do I get my earnest money back? What happens? Do I lose it if something happens? Well, generally there's 3 standard contingencies in the Tennessee contract. And if the deal falls through based on one of those contingencies, you as the buyer are going to get your earnest money back. And as the seller, unfortunately, you don't get to keep that earnest money. Obviously, one of the most common contingencies that a deal might fall through is financing. So there's a financing contingency in the standard Tennessee state contract. If the buyer loses their job, they get in a car accident, or anything happens that they can't get their loan, even if the lender wrote a pre-approval letter and then couldn't really do the loan, that buyer is not responsible for that lender writing a pre-approval when they couldn't do the loan or whatever the case might be. And that contract falls through based on the buyer not getting their financing, which means they can't buy the house. They don't have the money, not because they chose not to, they just can't. Then the buyer is going to get their earnest money back. Okay, the seller does not get to keep the earnest money in that situation. It's part of the contract. The next contingency that we see a lot, obviously, that's standard in there, is the appraisal. So if you're selling your house for $400,000 and the appraisal comes in at $370,000, a lender is not going to loan more than that appraisal value. And sometimes buyers will pay more than appraisal, but not always. Sometimes they don't have the funds to, whatever the case might be. But if they don't come to an agreement, the buyer and seller don't come to an agreement, and the appraisal comes in low, there is an appraisal contingency, so that contract can fall through at that time. And again, the buyer would get their earnest money back based on the appraisal coming through. So if you got your house under contract for $400,000, appraisal comes in at $370,000, the buyer says, you know what, I'll go $10,000 over appraisal. I'll give you $380,000, but that's all the cash I have by the time I pay my closing cost and all of that. I am not able to pay more than the $380,000. You say, no, I got to have at least $390,000. I'm not selling if you don't give me $390,000. And the buyer goes, well, I'm going to have to back out. Then you're not going to get to keep their earnest money. That earnest money goes back to the buyer based on their appraisal contingency. And then third, and we see this one a lot, of course, is the inspection contingency. There is a standard inspection contingency written into the state contract, and a buyer says, we're going to get an inspection, and they should get an inspection on the home. They're making a huge investment. They should know what they're getting into. When they get that inspection and there's a repair that they feel is absolutely necessary, it needs to be made for them to purchase the home, and the seller says, no, I'm not making that repair, they can't come to an agreement, then the buyer can withdraw from that contract based on the inspection contingency and again get their earnest money back. So those 3 contingencies are the main 3 that we see where buyers get their earnest money back. I'm not going to go into anything else off the wall because crazy stuff happens all the time, where whatever could happen and a buyer might get their earnest money back. But those are the standard 3 that are in the contract. What about the seller? When do I get to keep the earnest money if I'm a seller, right? Generally, if the buyer changes their mind or if they misrepresented something, you get to. So if a buyer just says, you know what, and we've seen stuff like this happen in this market, they get 2 weeks into the deal, inspection was good, appraisal was good, and they go, I just can't afford this house. I overpaid. Will you just take my earnest money and let me out of the contract? That has happened. And in that case, the seller gets to keep the contract. That's, generally it's if the buyer changes their mind or if they miss a deadline. If a buyer misses an inspection deadline and then they back out based on inspection, the seller may keep the earnest money, that kind of stuff. So generally it's if the buyer just chooses not to perform their different criteria of the contract or different contingencies, and they just changed their mind and decide they're not going to do what they had agreed to do, then the seller gets to keep their earnest money. It's fairly rare that a seller gets to keep the earnest money, but it does happen for sure. So anyway, any other question you have about real estate, we sell tons of real estate, 400 or 500 houses a year. Feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to answer your questions and always happy to help out in any way that we can. Hope this information helps you out, and I hope you have a great day.